Welcome to the panel room. We're here to talk about epic fantasy today, but before we get started, let's go around the room, have everyone introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about your experience with epic fantasy. And we'll go ahead and start with you, Gail.
Hi, I'm Gail Z Martin, and I've written 4 series of epic fantasy: Chronicles of the Necromancer, Ascendant Kingdom Saga, Darkhurst, and Assassins of Landria. So big fat fantasy to buddy flick fantasy and everything in between.
All right, perfect. Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I don't actually write epic fantasy. I just read a lot of it. So here I am. I actually write historical fantasy, several subgenres of romance, and with Jeannie Adams, the science fiction mystery series Outcast Station. But I really enjoy epic fantasy, a book that'll keep you occupied for a while.
Exactly. Joshua?
My name's Joshua Palmatier. I write epic fantasy for DAW Books. I have 3 trilogies out at the moment. The first one is actually in an omnibus form now called The Throne of Amancore, which of course is showing up backwards on there. So you can get that entire series all in one giant fat fantasy book. Okay, and my most recent series begins with Shattering the Lay. It's the Lay series. Okay, and that's not in a big fat omnibus yet. I'm not even sure they could put it in a big fat omnibus yet. I'm currently working on another trilogy that I just sold to DOS, so hopefully that will be out in 2022. And just as a little side gig, I created a small press called Zombies Need Brains, and we put out science fiction and fantasy anthologies. So if you're interested in themed anthologies, check that out as well.
All right, perfect. And finally, Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie. I write as Penelope. I write epic fantasy and paranormal romance. My fantasy series is the Earthslinger Chronicles, and the 4th book of the series, the 4th and final book, comes out next year. The first book, Song of Blood and Stone, was just on that list from Time Magazine of the 100 best fantasy books of all time. Dun, dun, dun. So.
All right, congratulations. So let's jump right in. And I'll start with you, Nancy, being the more reader slash, person that loves it than the writer. What makes a fantasy story epic?
For me, I'm not speaking for anyone else, but for me, the stakes have to be huge. I mean, there has to be a lot on the line. And I used to think that book also had to be a doorstopper. But I've come to realize that as long as the stakes are big, it really doesn't have to be a doorstopper. And so as long as it's engrossing, I feel like I'm reading a really meaty story that's got a lot of development and an important world and a big problem. That to me is epic fantasy.
All right, thank you. Joshua, what about you?
I tend to think this is not necessarily for writing, but mostly for reading. To me, an epic fantasy, like Nancy said, it's got to have the really big stakes. Usually it's got to be kind of world shaping stakes for me. And I also tend to think that the fantasy needs to have multiple point of views. You got to get a nice world view of the world. So usually that means you have to have multiple characters that you're following. So that you can get a good grasp of the entirety of the world, so to speak. Even though I say that, and that's kind of what I'm looking for my epic fantasies when I'm reading them. When I'm writing them, I have a tendency to keep my character list way down. So like the Throne of Amancore, there's one main character you follow through the whole series. I do have multiple point of views in my other series, but it is still pretty narrow. So I try to keep it relatively tight and don't go all, George R.R. Martin on it for the epic. That's a little too extreme for my taste, but lots of point of views, really big stakes. And I like it to have, or I like it to reveal a really complicated, large world.
All right. Leslie, how about you?
I agree with them. I would add a large, expansive setting So I think generally there's some sort of quest, there's travel, you're exploring the fantasy world in some way, and it feels like a big world. Even if it takes place all in one city, you're getting the sense that an entire world or planet has been created, and that like the stakes are high and they affect that entire place, and it's populated with lots of people and cultures and things like that. Those are some of the things that I look for in epic fantasy.
All right. And Gail?
I agree on the fact that the stakes need to be high and that there needs to be a lot of scope. It isn't just a problem between two people or two cities. It's got to be kingdom-wide, maybe worldwide. There's got to be, well, that's what makes it epic, the big battles, the big risk. Having said that, and I've written 16 of the doorstopper sized ones. So I started getting people coming up and saying, oh, I used to love to read epic fantasy, but I don't have time to read the big books anymore. So that's why the Assassins of Landria series is a bit of an experiment. They are thinner. They're only two-person point of view. It's the hero's story out of those multiple braided points of view that makes the big books big. And it's more of a buddy flick epic fantasy. So it's all the feels without the epic length. And that's, that's one way for people to keep enjoying epic fantasy when they're too busy to read, the door jam size. I've got plenty of those, but this is a new one. So I think it's possible to have the feels and the scope and the risk without all those other elements. And that gives readers a choice of reading a variety of versions of epic fantasy. It's kind of nice to break out of the mold sometimes.
So what does it take away? Because obviously by shortening it, you're taking out multiple POVs. I'm assuming a lot of the secondary characters, or?
Secondary characters are there, but not POV characters. So in a 600 and some page book, I'll have probably 4 viewpoint characters and 4 interbraided 4 interbraided storylines: the hero, the villain, 2 other point of view characters that allow us to see things from other locations. That's a lot of storyline to braid together, and that's why you end up at over 600 pages. When you narrow that down to just 1 or 2 perspectives that are the main go thread, the hero thread, you get a shorter book. You still get a lot of the feels. You don't get you can't do it. You can't have everything and still bring the word count down. Otherwise everybody only gets like 2 chapters and you're done. And it was an accommodation. It was an experiment. And I'm pleased with the way it's working out, to tell an action-packed adventure story with all of the epic feels and the world building and the magic and the religion and all of that. But streamlined for people who just don't have the time to sink into 180,000 pages, 180,000 words.
All right, thank you. Now next question, and I'll go with you, Joshua. How do you get the world building in those 600 to 900 to 1,200 to however many hundred pages you end up with epics? How do you get that in without it seeming like info dumping or risk losing the reader's attention?
Well, that is tricky. I think the cleanest way to do it is, don't think about trying to describe everything. What you want to do is you want to actually just have the people living it. These people live in this world. So they're not thinking about, what's in the room and what makes, they're not thinking about the mural on the wall and what kind of tea they're drinking and all that kind of stuff. They're not thinking of it in terms of, I got to get this across so that the reader experiences it. So what you do is you just let the character, him or herself, live the world. So, you know, and then because it's a point of view, usually third person limited point of view, you also can use the different characters to point out different things about the world. You know, people, when they walk into a room, not all of them notice the exact same thing in that particular room. So you use the character to kind of limit yourself a little bit as well in terms of what you write. But what it really boils down to is you just let the character live. So, you know, when you're talking to somebody, you know, and you're trying to get across some plot points while these two characters are discussing something, they're not just going to sit at the table and do nothing while they're discussing this, right? They're probably going to be in a cafe, and then you can bring in, you know, the tea is coming, and or whatever they're drinking is coming. And so you can work in little bits here and there that give the reader a feel for the world without you stopping and saying, oh, this tea came from this province in this country over here, and we've been at war with that country for 20 years now. And, you know, you don't need all of that. The writer might know all of that. The writer should probably know all of that, but you don't put that in the book. So what you're doing is you're trying to leave in enough little details that you leave the reader with the impression that everything is known about this world, even though they've only been told, like in a scene, maybe 5 different things about this world. You got to give them that feeling that the world is complete. And if they walk around the corner, they're going to still be in the world and not have stepped out of like a gray room or a set or something. So, and it all just comes down to sprinkling in little details.
And as a writer, how do you know when you've reached, I guess, critical mass with it? Short of going Tolkien's route of, you know, coming up with different languages and all that level of detail, obviously it's not something that everyone can do. How do you know when you've reached that level of world building?
You mean how do you know when you've gone too far?
or how to stop right before that point?
Well, I am a total pantser writer, so most of the world I don't actually know about when I sit down and start writing. I probably know, you know, very vague idea of what I want the world to feel like and where the characters are going to go. And I usually know quite a bit about the magic system itself because I've been thinking about the magic system for a while. But when I sit down and start writing the characters and the plot starts moving, I don't generally know tons about the world. In fact, that's why I enjoy writing, is because I'm kind of making it up as I go along. And so it's fun for me to kind of explore the world along with the characters. So at a certain point, while you're writing, when you're a pantser like me, at a certain point, sometimes you hit something and you're like, okay, I need to know more about this particular setting or this world or this culture or whatever. And so I will kind of stop and kind of flesh it out. And usually I flesh it out in what I'm writing and kind of explore it a little bit. But then when I go back for revisions, I end up cutting a lot of that out. That's just me thinking to myself through my characters, typically. So I end up cutting that out. Obviously, I'm not that good at it because my agent often will go through and say, okay, you need to cut, you know, X amount of words out of this. And he usually points out spots where I have not cut enough of the world building, the self-world building along the way. So I don't think any writer really can do it perfectly and knows exactly where the cutoff is. That's why we have agents and editors.
All right. Thank you so much. Leslie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, Josh had great points. I think that world building is like seasoning that you sprinkle on, and using only what you need is really important. Now, I'm a plotter, but my process is kind of similar. It's like, you know, as much as I plot ahead of time, I still go through and I need to know, where, what's the transportation like? I can't think of everything beforehand. So as I'm writing, I will stop and then figure those things out, do the research, and then come back and write. That's why the revision takes so long. And I do the fast draft. The first draft, I don't know any of that stuff. So it's really just about the story. And for me, the second draft is when I go through and tighten everything up and figure those things out. What are they wearing? What's the economics like? Where are they getting their food? All of these details that you go through the book with. And other people is really what it takes to let you know when you have to pull back. I agree with like beta readers or agents and editors, because you do as much as you can, but we're all in our own heads and we know 100% of everything. And we're only putting maybe 5 or 6% in the actual book. And so if we've put in 15% and we have to pull that back, it is very difficult for the writer to know that without someone else. Sometimes time works. Like if I'm able to have a few months away from the manuscript and can go back to it, and then I'm reading, I'm like, oh no, this is boring. this is too big of a chunk. Let me cut that in half. They don't need to know all of that. I was really proud of myself for coming up with that, that system of currency and economics, but you don't really need to know that for the story. So some of it is just being ruthlessly, thinking about the story ruthlessly and pushing it forward, and not being distracted by all the cool stuff that you wanted to put in it, that you thought of or that you researched and is in all of your notes. And that is something that that time can help with, because when you're focused on a manuscript for a long time and you're just in it, it's hard to see the forest through the trees. So like a combination of other readers, and then if it's possible to have extra time in your schedule, that has helped me in terms of pulling back and making sure that I'm not dumping everything I've ever thought of into this world.
All right, thank you so much. Gail.
Well, I come at it a little differently. I'm a plotter, and for the epics, and talking here especially about the big fat fantasies, the big ones with all those intertwined plot threads, I plot the whole thing out, multi-page outline, and I'll draw basically a critical path diagram and know what the go thread is, what has to happen, who's speaking chapter by chapter. If somebody's missing for too many chapters, then I know I need to bring them back in. Kind of do a pull up at about 2/3 of the way through to say, okay, who haven't we seen for a while? What point of view is missing? What do we need here? And I know what the through thread is to tell the main core of the story. So I have to make sure that that advances no matter whose point of view it is, chapter by chapter by chapter. As far as the world building, and each of my series has a different magical system. Each of my epic fantasy series has a different religious system. I made a rule for myself a long time ago that I don't do more than 2 paragraphs at a time of world building in any one place, and not big paragraphs, short paragraphs. Because I agree, the best world building is when people are just living in their world. To go back to Joshua's comment about the tea and not having to tell people about the war, if the war is really important, another way to recast that scene is that the person pours tea for a friend who's visiting, who says, oh, I haven't had this flavor in ages, it's so hard to get. And the friend said, yeah, since the war. And now you know that there's a problem that you may not need to know anything more about until chapter 20. But now you've got a little more about this world, that it's not all peace and love and flowers. So I love dropping that kind of stuff in. And frankly, I enjoy the magical system building and the religion building, the gods and goddesses and how it all works together. That's really the fun part for me, in addition to just coming up with the characters and putting them through hell.
Did you decide specifically to do different magic and different religions for each series, or it just worked out that way?
All of the epic fantasy series stand alone. They're not interconnected to anything else. So yeah, I wanted them to be very different. I didn't want to carry over something from one series into the next. I wanted it to feel very different for readers who had read one of the series, to have a very distinct sense of place, and that they are not just in another kingdom in the first series, they're in a completely different world.
Okay. Now, Nancy, how about your thoughts on the world building, both as a writer of other fiction and as a reader of epic?
I can go with a little info dump as a reader, especially if it's presented as a chronicle and it gives me the history of the world if it doesn't go on forever. Because if it goes on forever, then I start to think, well, why am I reading this and not the story that I thought I was reading? So I think it kind of depends on how you do it. Because I write historical fantasy, I have to kind of educate the reader to the important things about the period so that they understand the story as we go through. And I also try to keep it short because sometimes it's just easier to say in a character's internal monologue, something like, well, since the war, the roads had been bad and the king didn't care about it, rather than try to put that in conversation between characters. It depends, it's like that thing, you don't know you've gone too far until you've done it. And then you have to go back and kind of, or at least I don't, and then you have to go back and pull it back. But I wanted to pick up on something that Leslie said about travel, building the scope of the world. I went to actually a romance writers seminar with, I believe it was Kathleen Gillis Seidel years and years ago. And she was talking about how to make a story feel big when there are just two people at the center of it. And one of the things that she said was, the more places your characters go, the bigger your world is and the bigger your story is. And I've kind of always remembered that. So when people go on the road in a book I'm reading, there's a part of me that goes, oh, goody, we're going to see something new now. So I think it, like everybody said, it's a matter of balance. And I do have a tendency to find some obscure little fact and shoehorn it in there. And I depend on my friends to go, okay, this is really neat. And it's really great that you found this obscure little fact. But the thing about it is nobody but you cares about it. So, and when they say that, I take it out because I figure I'm not always the best judge of whether other people will share my little enthusiasms.
All right, thank you.
And I'd toss in there the two other things that can, depending on the story you're telling, make a big difference is the economic system and the geography. That has something to do with making it feel bigger, as well as saying something about how the world, how the kingdom itself functions, who has power, who doesn't, where the resources are, where they aren't. There's actually a guy at Ball State, a geologist, who teaches a class on geography for writers so that we don't have our rivers running backwards and, mining ore in places it could never have, formed. But those can be part of how you bring the world to life and how you add that scope to it too. Like, what do people do for jobs? Where does the money come from and who has it?
I think someone said once to really do a good job of world building, you have to know how their plumbing is done.
Right.
Once you get that down, it just all falls into place. So kind of bouncing off of that, only the opposite side, what do you think people get wrong? We'll start with you, Leslie. Now this could be as a writer, as a reader, what do you, I guess your pet peeve with epic fantasy?
I think that my pet peeve is if people haven't thought certain things through, and I think it's kind of common to fantasy readers, but either your society is too homogenous, or if there is diversity, it sort of doesn't make any sense. Like there's a series that is very popular and it's got a small island, or it's a very small world in the map. And there's all kinds of different people. There's different races and there's analogs. You can tell there's analogs to Black people and Asian people, but there's no reason why throughout evolution, these people have developed such different features living so close to one another. Something like that, where it feels sort of tacked on and it doesn't feel like an organic world that has been around for thousands of years where people have developed. And conversely, when there's a world and everyone looks exactly the same, that's also a pet peeve of mine because that doesn't represent reality either. So it's just I think we all are talking about thinking through all of these things and making sure that they feel grounded and they feel realistic, even if your realism is magical. If there's a magical reason for it, then give us that. But when things just don't make sense, like I remember I was listening to the Writing Excuses podcast and years ago, and they were like, if there's a city in a desert, you really have to tell us where they get their water from. Like, how are they surviving? And I actually took that as a challenge. I'm like, oh, I'm going to write a story about a city in a desert, but I'm going to think through, okay, how does the water get there, and where are their supplies from, and what does that mean? Like, what are their houses built of? And how do they make their furniture if there's no forests, and things like that. So like you said, the plumbing, I mean, to that, you don't have to have extensive notes on it, but I at least try to go through a list of everything in a person's sphere, like from the time they get up to the time they go to bed, everything they interact with, how did that come to be? And even if it's just a thought exercise and I don't necessarily write it down or it doesn't appear anywhere, at least I have considered it, however briefly. And sometimes I consider it, more than others, some things more than others. And then, just try to make it feel like a three-dimensional place where you've carefully considered everything. So I'm a close reader, and I notice things like that. And I think that epic fantasy readers, we have a higher tolerance for info dump a lot of times. We have a higher tolerance for those kind of things. So it's also, as an author, knowing your readers and knowing that they're different from other readers, like paranormal romance readers. If I'm focusing on in the different genres of books, because I know the readers are focused in on different things. And so that's just some of my pet peeves.
All right, how about you, Gail?
I think from an author's perspective, it's when you encounter somebody, and this usually comes up in like a review somebody writes, where they have only ever understood medieval history from an overview class in high school, or maybe something on the History Channel. And so they're very quick to tell you what didn't exist, and they're incorrect. They will tell you that women were never warriors. Wrong. That there were never enlightened monarchs. Wrong. They're coming from a very superficial perspective, like you didn't do your homework, instead of going, wow, that's cool. I wonder if that's real. And I think that spoils their enjoyment of it, but then they're also quick to want to tell you that you did it wrong, and that's not the case. So there's a lot more depth and weirdness and diversity and all kinds of stuff in real history that a lot of times people just don't believe is real, and the real stuff is actually weirder than what you're writing. And I think the other piece to that is, well, let me give you an example of that. This was actually a reviewer who thought I had done something really cool, because they credited me for taking the urban fantasy trope of vampires and using it in a medieval setting. And wasn't that incredibly novel? And I'm going, Vlad the Impaler did it 600 years ago. I'm just following on, but here was somebody who wasn't familiar with the genre, thinking that this was something really unique. And I'm going, no, it kind of started here and then went there. So it's funny, but it's also something that obviously creates a stumbling block for readers. And you wish that they could just kind of enjoy it and go, wow, I learned something from that. That was really cool.
Nancy.
It bothers me, which will probably surprise nobody since I'm into history, that when people set up a history for their world and then they don't develop it, it's just like they kind of toss it out there because they feel, well, I need something. And so it doesn't matter to the story the way they work it in. I mean, I think about Star Wars, which is certainly not epic fantasy. It's almost sui generis, space fantasy. But one of the things that made that world appealing was that Luke's land speeder was old. It was battered. The buildings were old and battered, and they looked lived in. And even just that, not so much, we don't get a history lesson of Tatooine, but it gave the world depth and texture. And when people set out to create something like that, or they set out to create a history and they don't really put some thought into it, then I find myself going as I read, but what about this? But you said this and now that, and this doesn't fit. And it's just, that's the main thing that bothers me. If I feel like the writer hasn't put thought into developing the world so that it's cohesive.
All right. And Joshua.
Okay, you guys ready for this? Oh, here we go. My biggest pet peeve with epic fantasy is when you have supposedly these world-shaking events happening in the world, and then at the end of the series, it doesn't feel like anything has changed. The world still feels the same. The people still feel the same. I mean, maybe, the giant overlord cathedral is collapsed or something like that, but the fantasy is where that never seems to actually alter the world and alter the society and stuff. That it really bothers me that the world itself doesn't seem to have changed, even though you supposedly had these world-shaking, huge stakes, right? Because even if you manage to stop the huge stakes from happening, it's going to change the world. The world's got to change along with it, right? The worlds aren't static. Societies aren't static. So if big things are happening, then there should also be corresponding big changes. So that's probably the biggest thing that bothers me. And that's one of the main reasons I sat down and said I want to write some epic fantasy, is because I wanted to write epic fantasies where by the end of the series, huge things have changed the society. So the world is completely different. The society has reacted to the changes, and or the big journeys or the big battles and all that kind of stuff, that things have changed. So that's one of the main reasons I sat down and said I want to write epic fantasy. Another pet peeve with epic fantasies is you created this really cool magic system, but you don't think about how society is going to use that magic system. Like we take absolutely everything that we create and we find every possible purpose for it or use for it in our society, right? I mean, we created Velcro so that we could slap things on spaceships, up in space, but think about Velcro now, it's like everywhere, right? So we take everything that we create and we use it in as many ways as we possibly can. And a lot of times the magic system in epic fantasy is just kind of there and the magician seems to use it, but nobody else touches on it. So I much prefer epic fantasies where the author has sat down and said, yes, we have this magic system and we have these magic users. How is the everyday person going to end up using the magic? Or manipulating the magic, or manipulating the magic users to, get what they want, because that's what humans do. We use everything. And then my other pet peeve with my last pet peeve for now, my last pet peeve for epic fantasies is when the series starts out and never seems to end. Where, I'm going to throw some names out there and people will hate me for it, but like Robert Jordan's series, it got started. I absolutely loved it. I hit that third book and I was like, this is the best thing I've ever read. And then, by the sixth book, I'm like, why is it taking a 1,000-page book to advance the plot 24 hours? I'm like, part of it is because it just became so popular that the publishers wanted more and whatnot. And part of it is that I think the author got a little too neck deep in their own world. And so they started including the stuff that we talked about earlier that you can't throw in there, and you need to edit all of that kind of stuff out after the fact. But I really hate it when I start enjoying a really good epic fantasy and then all of a sudden it was supposed to be 3 books, and then the next thing you know it's 5 books, and then the next thing you know it's 8 books, and that, I think, I call it bloat. That kind of bloat when it starts with an epic fantasy series, that really bothers me. I'm just like, you had a story, you thought it was 3 books, keep it 3 books or 5 books or whatever you thought it was to start with. Okay, so I'm done on my little rant.
All right, now this can actually kind of link into it. We've seen a lot in recent years of books being turned into TV shows or movies. Epic fantasy is, of course, one of those. With, we've got The Witcher, Lord of the Rings was done as movies, Dune has been done now. This will be the 3rd time coming out. Game of Thrones. Because we've all seen how some of these have ended up, can epic fantasy work? And why doesn't it work sometimes? And I'll start with you, Gail.
Short answer, because the powers that be don't understand epic fantasy, and therefore they want to shove it into the mold of a contemporary drama. If the powers that be don't understand the genre, then they don't understand the conventions of the genre that draw readers to that genre. And they try to make everything fit the mold of a crime drama or a contemporary angsty love story or a spy thriller. And those have very different beats. And so then you have people altering the structure that worked very well for an epic fantasy to make it better. And it doesn't, because it's no longer an epic fantasy. It's a crime drama with period costumes, or it's been substantially changed. And I think that comes from the very top of people who just don't get it, and therefore they don't trust their writers, or they don't trust the original author enough to know something they don't and enforce their will, and it goes badly.
Do you think it does better for movie, TV series, miniseries?
I think
Because you've got the tons of supporting characters as one of the, I guess, tropes of epic fantasy, which definitely would work with, I would say, series, but
I think you could definitely do, I think it lends itself to a series well, although, I'm a fan of the Lord of the Rings movies. I enjoyed them, even though they departed from the books in a lot of ways. But Peter Jackson understood the series, and he had creative control. And I think that made all the difference. If you have a showrunner who has creative control and the clout to keep people from sticking their fingers in and meddling, then you can do a great series or series of movies. If not, you're going to have people from LA going, oh, this would be so much better with a love triangle here. They're in the middle of a war. Yeah, but a love triangle would make it so much better. And then it all just falls to hell.
all right. Nancy.
I think I would prefer to see epic fantasy adapted as a miniseries with a complete arc. If it's going to be an ongoing series, then do one arc at a time. Don't try to drag it out ad infinitum, because you do lose elements of the story. My husband and I came out of the Fellowship of the Ring, and we're like, well, where's Tom Bombadil, and where's the Barrow Wight, and where's this, and where's that? Well, by the time we went back to see it again, we kind of adjusted, because my husband, who used to teach Tolkien, pointed it out to me, and he says, here's the thing, if they put all that stuff in there, we'd still be sitting in the theater. You do have to call a halt at some point. So I think it can work, as Gail was saying, if the people in charge have a complete story arc, have creative control and understand the story. It's not epic fantasy, but I think one reason Patty Jenkins's Wonder Woman movie worked so brilliantly is that she understood Wonder Woman. and she was true to the concepts behind that character. And ultimately, I think that's what every fan of anything wants when they see material that they love adapted.
What do you think of the Sandman? Because to me, that's pretty much epic fantasy, even though it's comic book.
Well, I have to confess, I have not read it. I've heard
Oh.
people rave about it, but I haven't read it.
All right. So Joshua.
I'm going to start by agreeing with Gail that in general, Hollywood does not understand epic fantasy. There have been very, very few successful epic fantasy like adaptations or anything like that. Obviously, Peter Jackson and Lord of the Rings is one of the successes, and like everybody has said, the reason it's so successful is because Peter Jackson understood his material. I mean, he was basically a fan, right? So he understood the material, and like Gail said, they gave him creative control, and so he understood how to take the idea behind an epic fantasy and translate it into not one movie, because he wasn't stupid and said we're just going to do one movie and then we'll do another if it's successful and then we'll do another one after that if it's successful. He went into this with the idea that in order for the story to be told, it has to be 3 movies. So he understood the whole scope, that there was absolutely no way to do it in one movie. You just couldn't do it. So he understood that. And then at the same time, he understood, like Nancy pointed out, that you can't fit everything in the book into the movie. That it's never going to happen with an epic fantasy. And that's never even going to happen if you step outside a movie and you allow yourself a series, okay, or you allow yourself multiple, series, multiple season series. If somebody is going to successfully translate an epic fantasy into a good series, they have to realize that, like Nancy said, you've got to have these arcs. The arcs can't be an episode at a time. I mean, you got to have a little mini arc each episode to make it work for TV. But the overall driving arc has to be the whole season. Like the whole first season has to be the first book, because that's how we write our trilogies, right? There's one big giant over arc, and then each book is its own little arc. And for TV purposes, that little arc that we talk about for a book is a whole season. It's not just one episode. So in order for epic fantasy to work for television, you need somebody behind the wheel that understands that whole smaller arc inside a bigger arc inside a bigger arc, that whole concept for epic fantasy. And there's not too many people in Hollywood that really understand that, in my opinion, at least that I've seen.
So going back to the Lord of the Rings, having one movie per book, what do you think of The Hobbit when they stretched that into 3? Was that too far the other direction?
Oh yeah, that was a disaster. It was complete disaster, because The Hobbit, the story behind The Hobbit, is not as epic as the story behind Lord of the Rings. I mean, it was much more of a personal story. I mean, it was really about, Bilbo and the ring, and Peter Jackson did not handle that very well. I think he wanted to do another grand epic Lord of the Rings fantasy, but there's nothing in the Tolkien lore that had that same scale. And and of course Hollywood was pushing him because they, were saying, we made a ton of money off of the Lord of the Rings, so stretch it out and so we can make a ton of money off of The Hobbit as well. And he should have resisted that, in my opinion. I think he could have done a really excellent Hobbit movie as just one movie. But unfortunately that didn't happen.
All right. Finally, Leslie.
Yeah, I think that greed is often a problem I agree with Nancy that like a limited edition series, something like Watchmen, which is not epic fantasy, but you have one season to tell a story, and you can quibble about the actual adaptation of the original material. But I think going into it knowing, all right, this is going to be a one season deal or one season for the first book, and we'll throw it all on the table. So I think that being able to walk away and resist that urge to have that bloat where you just creep and we're going to have, oh, it's really popular. Well, instead of, 6 seasons, let's make it 8 seasons, and we'll split this book into 4 seasons. And like, the beginning, the first couple of seasons of Game of Thrones, everyone's on board and it's great. And then they start diverging and they don't know what they're doing. And there's other reasons for that. The books obviously didn't materialize, but like, there's a lot of reasons why things go wrong, but I think that greed is part of it in terms of this is making money, this is successful, let's keep it going, even if the source material isn't there for us to keep stretching it out. So if you have someone with enough power to say, we're doing 1 season or we're doing 2 seasons max, and this is how I'm splitting the story up, and we know we're gonna have to change it, but we're going to keep to the themes, or find that thing that people love about it that made you want to adapt it in the first place, and try to be true to that, even if you have to combine characters or remove characters and plot lines, because it's a totally different medium, so the adaptation is going to be different. But if you find one thing, that core feature that made people love the series, and bring that onto the screen, then I think you have a chance of being more successful, and resisting that urge to, if it's really popular, to change the plan. I think pre-planning ahead of time is the key to things that were successful. And you saw it with Peter Jackson when he loved Lord of the Rings. You could feel the love. People spent 6 years, however many years it took them, living in New Zealand making that movie. I mean, children were born, and like marriages happened. That was love for everyone involved. And The Hobbit felt like a money grab. You did not feel the love there. You just felt like this was something that was dialed in and stretched out for monetary reasons, which, we're all balancing art versus business doing this. But yeah, you have to kind of fight that, and try to be true to the material and the spirit and the heart of it as much as you can.
All right, perfect. Now, to close it out, because I know we got some stuff going on with some of the guests, just go around again, let people know where they can find you. And we'll start with you, Nancy.
You can find me on the web at nancynorthcott.com. I'm occasionally on Facebook, where I'm Nancy Northcott author, and I spend far too much time on Twitter, where I'm at Nancy Northcott. So you can find me usually on Twitter the fastest.
Perfect. Joshua.
If you want to find out about my books and the small press, just check out joshuapalmatier.com. And then for the press, it's zombiesneedbrains.com. I'm more on Facebook than anything else. So just look for Joshua B. Palmatier on Facebook. Also, Zombies Need Brains on Facebook as well. But I am on Twitter. For Zombies Need Brains, the Twitter handle is ZNBLLC. So that's the small press. And then my personal account on Twitter is Ben Tate Author. And that's a horrendously long story, so don't ask. But Ben Tate Author on Twitter.
All right, thank you. Leslie.
My website is lpenelope.com, and I have a podcast that is called My Imaginary Friends, and that's at lpenelope.com/podcast. It's my weekly audio blog. And I'm mostly on Instagram, but my Instagram and Twitter handles are both Leslie Penelope.
All right, and finally, Gail.
You can find me at gailzmartin.com. My Twitter is at gailzmartin. My reader group is Shadow Alliance, and my page is The Winter Kingdoms. And everything else is either GZ Martin or Gail Z Martin. I'm pretty easy to find.
All right. And I want to thank everyone for coming in, and thank all of you for watching. Have a good one. Bye.
Thank you. See you guys later.